Очень рада здесь, потому что последний раз была в Ереване больше чем 30 лет тому назад, когда я была студентка МГУ. Но надо должен извинить, буду говорить по английскому языку, но попробую говорить помедленнее, даже если это не в моем характере. My paper today is part of a larger project on abstraction, because I choose abstraction because you can go transnational, which is very convenient and also opens a lot of kind of different avenues, because you have kind of philosophical aspects, you have the art itself, you have art and science issues, then of course politics come in. So there is a lot of variety, and I actually like to kind of go across different themes or kind of categories. So today I will only look at a small part, basically up to the 1930s, and only kind of 3 notions. But what I recently have been interested in is the promises which abstraction has been pursued, because if one looks over the kind of 80 years, abstraction has been kind of supposedly been dominating in Western art as an avant-garde expression. It's amazing how many kind of different issues have been attached to it. And that's exactly what I'm interested in, to look at kind of what has attached, and sometimes it's totally contradictory if one moves over time, and why and how this has evolved. I guess I just start and then we'll get to pictures. So looking back at the 20th century, abstract art seems to have been one of the most viable and dominating artistic idioms in painting throughout the century. Thank you. This fundamentally new artistic practice and visual experience of modernism emerged at the beginning of the 20th century in Central and Eastern Europe, and reached its peak in the art, political, and cultural debates of the Cold War. A closer look at abstraction in modern European and American art, however, reveals that it was also a highly contested artistic expression, which served various artistic agendas and cultural and political ideologies. Many artists working in this style found themselves rather on a defensive, no matter if in Nazi Germany, Paris of the 1930s, the United States of the 1940s and 50s, or the Soviet Union from the 1930s to the 1980s. And that's something to keep in mind, that of course it's always highly celebrated as the most avant-garde and advanced, that basically if one looks back in time, one sees even in Paris in the 1930s, oh, we have to get organized because surrealism is taking over and we are basically falling out of favor and basically are becoming a niche. Abstraction has inspired, provoked, enriched, and shaped our visual world now for more than 100 years. Art historians have approached abstract art from various perspectives and interpreted it in numerous ways. Historically, the emergence of abstract art has been linked to Romanticism and Impressionism, as well as Jugendstil and Art Nouveau design. Theorists as well as practitioners devoted considerable time and effort to devising complex strategies intended to ratify its existence as a valid art form in general, and in particular as one endowed with expressive powers and capable of evoking alternative levels of reality and consciousness. In recent years, however, the search for general principles in the interpretation of abstract art has been more or less abandoned. Instead, the emphasis has been on the immediate historical contexts in which abstract works of art were being produced. In the 21st century, the engagement of contemporary artists with digital visualization practices and the use of new digital media for art projects has sparked new investigations into the forms and functions of abstraction and the interpretation of abstract patterns. And that's kind of an interesting point now, that we are basically looking back at abstraction from the digital age, and that basically a generation which is not so much, or for which modernism could also be the Middle Ages, as I now realize with my students, basically look with this at kind of a really fresh eye, but of course from a very different perspective. And I think with the avant-garde, it's very similar, because we basically now have a generation for whom the 60s or anything before is past. And it doesn't matter how far in the past it is, there is no connection anymore. And then there is, of course, also it usually sparks a new interest. Yeah, thank you. Hilary, an abstract artist herself and the driving force behind the founding of the Salomon and Guggenheim Museum in New York, held that the concept of non-objectivity to be above all artistic forms of expression, from academic art to impressionism and expressionism, as well as cubism and abstraction, writing in 1939, and I quote, and you have it on the screen, all these isms derive their inspiration from an objective art. Development from academic painting to abstraction of objects leads to visionary art, non-objectivity, and she is a real believer in non-objectivity. The non-objective painting stands by itself as an entirely free creation conceived out of the intuitive enjoyment of space. It is the visual experience of rhythmic balance in form, design, and color. The non-objective picture is far superior to all other in its influential potentiality, educational power, and spiritual value of humanity, which already gives you that abstract art has to be avant-garde. I mean, and of course, something which again gets used during the Cold War is also this superiority. And that's a concept I find very interesting, which in general kind of pertains to Western art, kind of how is it established and how is it basically perpetuated. In my presentation today, I will look at the arguments and strategies having been used to explain that abstract art, or better, the non-objective, is far superior to other art forms in terms of its creative potential, educational impact, and spiritual value to humanity. Central to my study is the examination of notions such as the belief that abstract art is capable of reflecting a metaphysical truth advancing the cosmic evolution of humanity. Second, the focus on a psychophysiology of perception of color, form, and sound, and questions about the nature of human creativity. And third, the perception that it can be seen as a direct reflection of the zeitgeist, serving to promote scientific discovery, technological advancement, and social progress. I'm particularly interested in the place the Russian avant-garde played within those concepts of modern Western modernism and the role it played in shaping modernist art theory and theories of abstraction. Let's start with terminology. What we term today as abstract art has not only many faces in terms of visual expression, but also comes with a number of diverse narratives. One of the most fundamental issues being if the artist arrives at abstraction through gradually abstracting from visual reality and the appearances of nature, as in the case of, for example, Kandinsky and Mondrian, or if he arises at it through creating forms and shapes that seem to not have an immediate pendant in nature, like in the case of Malevich, who proclaimed in his 1915 manifesto from Cubism and Futurism to Suprematism. Objects have vanished like smoke. To attain a new artistic culture, art advances towards creation as an end in itself and towards domination over the forms of nature. Hans Arp also conceived art neither as a copy nor as an imitation of nature when he formulated in his concern as an artist, we don't want to imitate nature, we don't want to depict, we want to educate. We want to form how the plant forms its fruit and not depict it. We want to educate directly and not indirectly. So while the terminology differs, there's agreement on the primacy and purity of the creative process. And here's also important that, of course, no matter which strand, basically the Russians are always in one of those. So that's, of course, something which also kind of places them early on at a very crucial point. So terminology is close tied up with abstraction as an alternative approach to capturing reality. The early pioneers of abstract art, Kandinsky, Kupka, Malevich, and Mondrian, shared the belief that art should not serve the reproduction of visible reality, but be an expression of the absolute. They viewed art, and in particular the abstract approach, as a medium to advance human creative evolution and lead the way into a new age of spiritual renewal. Fascinated by esoteric ideas, occultism, and theosophy, they focused on metaphysical questions, non-Western and so-called primitive art forms, and a syncretic approach to the study of world religions. This interest in mysticism and the occult as an answer to materialist thought and reductionist science in the late 19th century ran parallel to the search for spirituality in art. Artists such as Pankhouche, Kupka, Mondrian believed that they were able to see into and beyond the natural world and thereby gain an understanding of the cosmic principles of human existence, so a very kind of specific concept of avant-garde to kind of see beyond. They felt themselves to be messengers between two worlds, and communicating this knowledge became the objective of their art. Kandinsky's 1912 treatise on a spiritual art greatly influenced the production of and discourse on abstract art in Germany and Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Scandinavia and the United States. The studies on early abstraction have above all looked at the artist's interest in mysticism, occultism, and particular theosophy. And I guess this really started off with Sixten Ringboom in 1970, and they studied the sounding cosmos. Beyond their metaphysical explorations, artists such as Kandinsky and Kupka shared an interest in the conditions of the creative process and the psychophysiology of the perception of color, form, and sound. Both delved into theories on the sensory perception of color, form, and sound in contemporary physiology and psychology, including Gustav Theodor Fechner's psychophysics, Wilhelm Wundt's psychophysiological parallelism, and Ernst Mach's analysis of sensations. Kupka saw the work of art as an organism arising from the process of creation, a process that is conditioned by the subjective and objective factors. The creative process, he wrote, requires the involvement of all of the human senses, indeed the whole body, in a union of psychophysiological processes and chemical reactions, coordinated by the human brain. The work of art thus embodies a constant dialogue between intuition and reason and between intellect and instinct, whereby it is intuition that is the actual driving force of the creative process. In order for the work of art to address pure senses as well as their intellects, the artist must particularly concentrate on the interrelationships between his vision and the artistic means by which to convey it, which also explains why color theory and color-sound interrelations become very important. Kandinsky characterized the artist, as we all know, the hand by which by touching the various keys causes the human soul to respond to certain vibrations. The creative process begins as a resonance within the soul of the artist, an inner sound that is then expressed as a feeling or thought, leading to an appropriate artistic representation by means of the artist's perception, a process that fulfills the transition from objective to non-objective art. The question of adequate artistic means occupied an important place in the writings of Kandinsky and Kupka. Both agreed that in analogy to music, the painter had to cultivate the very own means of painting. Kandinsky, who subscribed to the idea of a Generalbass, described color and line as the artistic elements that constitute the essential, eternal, unchanging language of painting. And that's, of course, also one of the essentials of abstract art, that is something universal and essential and eternal. Kupka, in his treatise Creation in the Plastic Arts, dealt not only with the sense and the feeling of color, but also with the multitude of painterly elements and effects, as well as the space and its boundaries. The planes of the surface, the effects of light and atmosphere, and the virtual qualities such as rhythm, cadence, and movement. The steel artist placed universal principles of design above individual artistic style. Their path towards abstraction, as realized in neoplasticism, meant a severe reduction to elementary design means, straight lines according to the rectangular principle of the horizontal and the vertical, and the primary colors yellow, red, and blue, and the non-colors white, gray, and black. And Malevich built his works of suprematist elements, which were simple and similar in shape, and served as fundamental building blocks of a new world. Reducing all forms to zero, the black square, and then rebuilding the world. Malevich suprematist forms were basic elements of a specific energetic potential. Their power lay in the unlimited potential of their combinations and variations. The interwar period saw a secularization of the spiritual concerns of early abstractions. Individual artists, as well as art institutions, including, for example, the Bauhaus, turned to science and technology and the ideas of modern industrial production, leading eventually to the emergence of the movement of constructivism. Abstract art became a trademark of the modernist zeitgeist, taking into account the experience of modern life in a world that was characterized by urbanization and industrialization, rapid social changes, advances in science and technology, new modes of transportation, and forms of global communication. It represented, as Catherine Dreyer put it, and I quote, an art which belonged to our 20th century and not to the Renaissance or even the Impressionists. The extensive literature that deals with this focus on science and technology, industrial production, and an urban lifestyle has shaped our understanding of modernism well into the present. The constructivists saw themselves as part of a large international network promoting modernism and specifically abstract art, a new universal language that would lead to a new social consciousness, improve society, and change the world. And this idea of a universal language is then also very important in the 50s and 60s when it goes anthropological. This idea was further enhanced by the constructivist desire to transform art into designs for everyday life. Many of his representatives working in fields such as typography, advertising, product and interior design, and architecture. However, their beliefs that abstract art would serve as a universal visual language accessible to all regardless of nationality or culture, and shaped the design of an egalitarian society governed by mutual collaboration and an international spirit, remained a short and unrealized utopia. It is evident that until the outbreak of World War II, the Russian avant-garde was seen as an integral part of European modernism and even a driving force in the advancement of abstract art. In conclusion, I want to briefly highlight this notion by looking at two major exhibitions showcasing European modernism in New York in the mid-1920s and the mid-1930s. Sorry, I was one behind. Is this one? The Société Anonyme's International Exhibition of Modern Art was held at the Brooklyn Museum from November 19, 1926 to January 9, 1927. In cooperation with Duchamp, Leger, and Mondrian in Paris, Campendon, Kandinsky, Schwitters in Germany, and Bragliali and Pagnini in Italy, Catherine Dreyer succeeded in presenting 300 works of art by 106 artists from 23 countries, bringing to an American audience the entire spectrum of aesthetic and stylistically diverse forms of modernism, from expressionism, cubism, and futurism to Bauhaus, the style, and international constructivism, as well as Dadaism, surrealism, and modern American art. With the simultaneous release of her book, Modern Art, which Dreyer dedicated to Kandinsky on the occasion of his 60th birthday, she offered a compendium of contemporary art, recording the scope and breadth of the movement worldwide in a hope that it would benefit the universal brotherhood of artists, bringing together modern artists and making them known to each other throughout the world. So clearly this understanding of a large network. Modern art was, and I quote, bigger than any one nationality. It carries the follower into a large cosmic movement, which unites him in thought and feeling with groups throughout the world. Dreyer presented Russian avant-garde as an integral part of international modernism that culminated in abstraction. After the German section, the Russian one was the second largest in the Brooklyn exhibition and in a book. It featured, in this order, the artists Kandinsky, Bulyuk, Konstantin Alyalyov, who had executed the book cover and design, Pevsner and Garbeau, Lisitsky, Archipenko, Nikolai Vasilyev, and Nikolai Tchaikovsky. Kandinsky, to whom the publication was dedicated, was clearly the most important, but she also highlighted Pevsner and Garbeau, who stand out with tremendous force and vitality and who have introduced a new medium into the world of sculpture, the creation of sculptural three-dimensional pieces built out of celluloid. She further featured the suprematists and constructivists, the former under the leadership of Malevich, who built their paintings on simple principles that allow for numberless combinations of the greatest variety in the rhythm of related planes, in a balance of distributed color masses, in the proportions between full and empty spaces, whilst the closely related constructivists aim for the same precision, order, and organization as science. In the book, Dreyer specifically highlighted the achievements of these artists in terms of artistic novelty and the worldwide impact of the Russian avant-garde. And she writes, and you can read it on the screen again, the service which Soviet Russia rendered to the rest of the world has been chiefly that it has scattered most of its creative and living spirits over the whole world like a sower sowing his seed, so that all might benefit by the great spiritual contribution which Russia has to give. Before the revolution, Russia was such a closed book to the average person that few knew of the spiritual, intellectual, and artistic richness of its people possessed to such a highly developed degree. But now we find them in all countries, these creative forces showing us beauty along lines which we never visualized. Dreyer's comment to modern art, specifically the Russian avant-garde, was closely associated with their social and educational activism. She viewed modern art as a vital medium to free the spirit of man and to invigorate and enlarge his vision, because its real purpose is to stimulate our energies and increase our vision of life. Ten years later, Alfred H. Barr, founding director of the Museum of Modern Art, staged the exhibition Cubism and Abstract Art. This show was conceived as a retrospective and intended to give an historical survey of an important movement in modern art. So basically already is something which has completion. In the introduction to the catalogue, Barr declared that the day's most adventurous artists had grown bored with painting facts. By a common and powerful impulse, they were driven to abandon the imitation of natural appearances. To demonstrate the breadth of this modernist impulse towards abstraction, he assembled a wide-ranging exhibition of nearly 400 works of painting, drawing, printmaking, sculpture, architecture, furniture, theater design, and typography. As a strong promoter of abstraction in art, Barr was drawn to this art form for its absolute physiological honesty and its insistence on the absolute. He particularly valued the purity of style, the originality of invention, and the influence of the artist within an international matrix. Similar to Dreyer, he placed the Russian avant-garde next to modernist art from Fauvism to Purism in France, Futurism in Italy, Expressionism and the Bauhaus in Germany, the style in Neoplasticism in the Netherlands, Dadaism and Surrealism. He specifically maintained that abstract art in Russia began long before the revolution of 1917. The succession of artistic movements of the years 1918 to 1922 was merely a continuation of the previous 5 years' excitement in which Cubism, Rayonism, Suprematism, non-objectivism, Cubofuturism, and Constructivism. The show included paintings and sculptures by Archipenko, Garbo and Pevsner, Kandinsky, Larionov, Lisitsky, Malevich, Rodchenko, and Tatlin, and graphic works by Alexei Gan, Gustav Klutzis, Vladimir Lebedev, Lisitsky, Rodchenko, the Steinberg brothers, and David Sternberg. And designs for theater by Exter, Goncharova, Larionov, Nivinsky, Popova, Stepanova, Tatlin, and Yakulov. In the context of the exhibition, Barr drew up the now famous diagram of the origins and influences of modern art that was reproduced on a catalog's dust jacket and has shaped the narrative and presentation of modernism up to this day. As one can see in this chart, he saw abstraction as the artistic expression towards which contemporary art was evolving. The diagram traces the unfolding of modernist art chronologically, nationally and stylistically from the 1890s to the present, indicating an inevitable teleological progression towards abstraction, thereby playing out the polar opposition between intellect and intuition, technology and nature, the geometric and the organic. While his systematic perspective that resembled a scientific approach and relief a formal analysis of any interpretive responsibility, Barr had a lasting impact on art history writing and art criticism well into the 1960s. He not only paved the way for Clement Greenberg's formalist theory, but also for the arguments by which abstract art was to be used in the cultural battles of the Cold War. Thank you very much.